Hi, and welcome to Terry Talks Movies. This time around, I got a couple of action films for you. One from the late 60s, one from the early 1970s. One's pretty much forgotten, and the other one should be better remembered. But before we do that, I've got a lot of friends in America who are really in a bad way at the moment and are pretty sad about various things. I'm not going to go into the details of what they are because we know what they are. And they are not doing well with it. So all I can say is that this channel is a safe space for people. If you want to talk to me, if you want to rant and rave, whatever you need to do when we're doing live streams or in comments or anything like that, feel free to. We're living through difficult times and we've got to be together when we do that, particularly if you're in a minority group or in a group of people who is not going to function well for the next 4 years. Just wanted to put that out there. This is a safe space. This is a safe channel and you have my best wishes. So let's leave all that aside now and talk about a couple of films, oddly enough. So let's get right into it. This one is part of the Warner Brothers Archive collection, so it's on DVD. No extras, bare bones, widescreen, doesn't look too bad. And I'll give you the blurb for it. An undercover narc takes on the mafia in this neatly crafted thriller. Directed by Brian G. Hutton, who did When Eagles Dare. Starring David McCallum, Stella Stevens, Telly Savalas, and Rip Torn. Sol Madrid, the movie's called. It's a hidden, not quite gem, it's a hidden semi-precious stone, let's put it that way. Just as David McCallum was finishing up with The Man from U.N.C.L.E., he wanted to go on to do other things, of course. He was a bit typecast as Ilya Kuryakin, the Russian uncle agent. He did this movie without changing his hairstyle very much at all. It's an MGM movie and he uses a whole bunch of leftover sets from various things. And it's one of those studio pictures that if you're measuring this movie on the William Goldman scale, the William Goldman scale is this. There's three kinds of movies. There's movies that were meant to be good and are, movies that aspire to being good and aren't, and movies that were never meant to be good in the first place. They were just there to make money or fill a gap in a schedule, something like that. This one's the third kind. It was never meant to be good. It was just an actioner they could put on as a second feature and put on in cheaper cinemas and then sell on to television. It doesn't have the oomph or the balls of many other action films of its time. And David McCallum playing, first off, a guy called Sol Madrid, which has got to be the least David McCallum name of any movie name you could think of, with the possible exception of Penelope Pitstop, which is a TV character, come to think of it. David McCallum doesn't cover himself in glory in this movie. He's supposed to be a tough, ruthless, deadly Interpol agent. And he does, knock off a few people in the movie. But he never has that machismo that you need for this kind of role, that kind of masculine energy, to use a term that right-wing people have now co-opted for their own purposes. This is a kind of movie that's better suited to the man who married David McCallum's ex-wife, Jill Ireland, Charles Bronson. It's David McCallum in a Charles Bronson role, and that just doesn't work. Villanova, the villain, played by Rip Torn. There was an interesting little bit of backstory to that. It was going to be played by John Cassavetes, but John Cassavetes dropped out of it. And various reasons were given. Some people said he was sick, some people he said his own project to do. But there is an interesting little bit in IMDb which I find a bit of fun. Now, some people say Cassavetes did start to do the movie but left early and decided not to continue, and then Rip Torn was brought in. But according to IMDb, John Cassavetes, who left the production early, said that one of his co-stars, Ricardo Montalban, who plays a Mexican undercover agent, is to improvisational acting what Mount Rushmore is to animation. Now, whether that's true or not, this is nearly 60 years ago now, so take it or leave it as a possibility that Cassavetes actually said that. And it's interesting that he would have said that too, because Villanova, the character, doesn't have many interactions with Jalisco, the undercover guy played by Ricardo Montalban. This is so much a B picture, and so much a picture that, again, you can pick apart bits and go, I wish they had gone hard there. Wish there had been a little bit more grunt to it. But it's an MGM studio picture, and that particular factory wanted everything to look good. It had a studio style. And so there are weird things like the design of the villa where the evil drug baron Emil Dietrich, played by Telly Savalas, lives, has a very kind of generic MGM studio style about it. There are green cane armchairs. It's got a look about it that screams MGM in the 1960s. And that doesn't lend itself to plausibility or believability at all. Stella Stevens playing Stacey, the woman who's running away from her boyfriend played by Rip Torn, something which she also did in another movie in the 1970s, Slaughter, with Jim Brown. She ran away from Rip Torn in that one as well. She's pretty good in this, but Stella Stevens was always a professional. Her character is just basically there to be the ex-girlfriend who just wants to get away and doesn't want anything to do with what the cops or Interpol are doing. And she has this arc where she's captured by Villanova. I won't do a spoiler on it, but who gets his revenge against his ex-girlfriend. And Telly Savalas playing Dietrich plays it very flamboyantly. He is over the top. He's playing it like he is auditioning for the role of Blofeld on Her Majesty's Secret Service. He's got a little bit of that going there. And it's a bit of fun because Telly Savalas clearly knows what kind of the movie this is, what is required of him to do it, and exactly how he's going to play it. And he is charming and ruthless and a little bit camp as well, which lifts the movie just that little bit. Ricardo Montalban playing Jalisco. It's an interesting little role for him. He's still at that stage of his career where he's kind of combing his hair around to make it look like he's got a full head of hair rather than using hair pieces. But it's a pretty grounded role by Montalban. He does pretty well in it. We also get Michael Ansara in there playing a Mexican policeman, which is kind of generic because, he had a slightly darker complexion. So we got cast as First Nations Americans and Mexicans a lot, even though he was of Syrian origin. And we get a couple of other familiar faces in there. Perry Lopez turns up. Perry Lopez, who played the cop who works with Jake Gittes in Chinatown. He's in there playing a henchman as well. Now, this movie used to turn up a lot on TCM back when I had cable. The soundtrack is very, very odd. It's a soundtrack by Lalo Schifrin. Schifrin is really good normally, but this one seems to be all over the place. It doesn't really hold together as a soundtrack and doesn't hold together the action of the movie at all. This was towards the end of MGM being a big studio in Hollywood, and it had a number of spectacular failures, mostly with trying to bring big budget movie musicals into the 1960s and really not understanding the zeitgeist of the era. And you could argue that this one doesn't either. If this movie had gone really hard and gritty and tough, it might have landed. But to do that, you would have had to have somebody else playing the main role who was never leading man material. You can make an argument that Robert Vaughn was, to a certain extent, in a certain kind of film. But David McCallum was never that. He was a Scottish character actor, basically, who turned into a teen idol for a while and parlayed that into a career later on of playing eccentric characters. In spite of all of that, I kind of like Sol Madrid for a couple of reasons. First off, it's one of those anomalies of the 1960s studio system where you can see them starting to try to do something new and something a bit tougher and something a bit grittier, but not actually having the courage or the ability to make something grounded, or maybe get a director and a producer in who knew what they wanted to do and would reference things like French crime cinema of the 1950s or something that would have given it that toughness that this one is singularly lacking. It played careful, and that's the worst possible thing you can do in any kind of crime movie, I think. If you're going to do a crime movie about heroin addiction and heroin smuggling and getting people addicted to drugs and the people who do that, I think you're going to have to, get a bit dirty and get a bit grungy and get a bit tough and uncompromising. And unfortunately, this movie doesn't do that. It's in beautiful Technicolor. It looks fantastic, but it just doesn't work because it doesn't have the conviction of its premise. But I kind of like having a few of these movies around because they are part of the history of cinema, and particularly the history of crime cinema. And there are going to be times when I want to watch something like this, not have to think about it too hard, not be too shocked and too horrified, and still being aware of how the studio system and the big studios like MGM were entirely clueless to the social and cultural changes of the 1960s. And this one is a bit of a benchmark of that. So I watched that. Then I went to the 1970s and a movie directed by Peter Collinson, who had directed The Italian Job. So he knew his way around action cinema. It's based on a novel by James Mitchell, the fourth in a series of novels about a secret agent called John Craig, which are good reads. James Mitchell also wrote under the name of James Munro, and was the guy who in the 1970s made the Callan TV series with Edward Woodward. So he knew his way around espionage. He knew how to tell a good espionage story. And he had these different parallel tracks of his career where he was making those kind of movies a TV series as well. And also period dramas like When the Boat Comes In were made for television, all under his name. And this one was the last feature film that Stanley Baker starred in. It's based on the fourth of the John Craig novels, which are a little hard to find, but if you look around eBay, you can find them. Innocent Bystanders. Nice, tough little spy drama, which has a killer cast and tells a really good story. In this, Stanley Baker says John Craig, an agent who has been tortured by somebody in his career, and that torture has diminished him. He's working for Department K, and the head of Department K is a very emotionless spy boss called Looms, played by Donald Pleasence.
Blake, good to see you. Can I get you something?
Could I have a dry martini?
I shouldn't think so.
Looms is using Craig to train his new agents. A woman called Benson, played by Sue Lloyd, and a sadistic guy called Royce, played by Darren Nesbitt. He's doing hand-to-hand with Royce, he's doing gun training with Benson, and they're just that little bit faster, that little bit harder than he is, because he's lost his edge because of this torture that he's undergone, which emasculated him. Basically, somebody, when he was captured, put electrical leads to his genitals and made him impotent. And Craig is still dealing with that trauma. Loomis isn't going to let him go or let him retire, because nobody retires from Department K. Once you're in, you're in. And Loomis comes up with this plan to find a missing agronomist called Kaplan. It's found a way of desalinating seawater on the cheap so that it can be pumped into deserts and deserts can bloom. And this is something that there's a bit of a war between Russia, America, and England on who gets this guy Kaplan and uses him for leverage with the other intelligence agencies. America wants it. England wants it because they can sell Kaplan to America. Then America will give them some plans that they've grabbed from China about China potentially hostile taking over Hong Kong before 1997. And England wants a copy of those plans. But nobody knows where Kaplan is. Kaplan has a brother in New York City. And the idea is the Department K is going to send Craig, Royce, and Benson to find the brother and find out whether the brother knows where his brother, the agronomist, is. Because the brother's hiding out. He's escaped from a Russian prison camp and he is hiding out somewhere in Eastern Europe. Craig gets sent separately from Benson and Royce because Craig's the decoy. He's the one that's going to draw attention from the Russians. He's the one that's going to draw attention from the Americans, so that the younger agents, Royce and Benson, can eventually find Kaplan and grab him. Once Craig gets to New York, he finds out that they haven't left him a gun. He's got some money, but he hasn't got a gun. And he meets the brother and tries to convince the brother to tell him if he knows where his brother is. He also meets the brother's ward, a woman called Miriam Lohman, played by Geraldine Chaplin, who knows what's on the postcard that the agronomist has sent to his brother. And the postcard has clues to the agronomist's location. Geraldine Chaplin is the innocent bystander of the title. Craig kidnaps Lohman and takes her with him to Turkey because they know he's somewhere near Kutsk in Turkey. And it becomes a chase between the Russians, the two English agents, Royce and Benson, Craig, and the Americans. Now, while he's in New York, Craig is grabbed by the Americans and tortured, which is a little bit shocking at the time because Americans doing torture on friendly agents wasn't really something you saw much in spy movies. But they do it to Craig because they know what happened to Craig and they use that as leverage when they torture him. Really gritty stuff here. And Stanley Baker is fantastic in this role. He gives us a complex spy character who is a broken man until his only choice is to find this guy. It's the only choice he's got to stay alive. It's the only choice he's got to redeem himself as a person and to change his self-image from being a broken loser to being somebody of value. And Looms doesn't help because Looms is using him as a decoy. Looms is lying to him through his teeth. And Donald Pleasence gives us a fantastic character. Really emotionless and taciturn and passive-aggressive and nasty. There are some great scenes between Looms and Blake, the American intelligence head, played by Dana Andrews, where they're discussing the situation, basically giving us the info dump we need at the start of the movie. And that's cross-cut really interestingly with Craig training the other two agents. So you've got an info dump you've got to give the audience in this movie. But to make it more interesting and more palatable and less boring, they cross-cut it with the scenes of Craig training these other two agents. It's a beautifully done piece of editing and a really nice piece of script writing. And I like the way it's done in this film. And Loomis is one of the great, nasty spy masters of cinema for me. And Donald Pleasence does such a great job with the character. It's all on the page, of course, in the script. But the way Donald Pleasence does little bits of business, like when he's ordering lunch for himself and Blake, the American guy played by Dana Andrews. And he does it in Loom's Gentleman's Club, which has the worst food and the worst drinks imaginable. And the way Donald Pleasence plays that is humorous, but really malevolent at the same time. It's a lovely, nuanced piece of acting and another reason to love Donald Pleasence in movies. There's a lot of good location shooting in this movie. It's shot around the south of Spain, which is substituting for not only Turkey, but also Cyprus, where Craig takes Kaplan once he finds him. And there's so many good bits in this movie. So I don't want to spoil the plot here, but there's so many good bits in this movie. There's things like the tenderness between Craig and Miriam, the woman he kidnaps and takes to Turkey. And Geraldine Chaplin and Stanley Baker play those bits really well. They're quite sensitive. And the awareness of the two characters of each other is done in a really fascinating way, which could be really icky in other hands and in other ways. But it plays it really straight down the line. And we learn more about Craig, but we also learn to like the character, even though he is essentially a blunt instrument in the same way, of course, that James Bond is in the Daniel Craig iterations. There's also a comic relief character, a Turkish guy called Omar, who learned English from World War II Australian diggers in the desert. And so he uses lots of old-fashioned Australian slang. He's played by English actor Warren Mitchell. And Warren Mitchell lived a long time in Australia towards the end of his life and knows Australia really well. So his character of Omar, with his Australian slang and his military slouch hat and his attitude and his avariciousness, is a lot of fun. And this kind of comic relief character is a nice way of balancing things when they get really grim and gritty and tough, because this is a very tough spy movie. But having Omar as a side character gives you that little leavening of a different mood that I think a lot of really gritty spy movies don't have these days and possibly need. But I like Warren Mitchell in this. He does a really good job of it. And because he's not playing an Australian, he's playing a Turk who learned to speak English from Australians. Any problems with the slight changes in accent aren't as offensive as they are when, say, an American tries to do an Australian accent. There's a good soundtrack on this one too. It's got a really kind of banging twang guitar soundtrack, which works for me, and it's not overdone. It's not there all the way through the movie, but only during certain scenes. The action scenes are crisp. There's a scene where Royce and Benson have to torture information out of Miriam Lohman, which is done subtly, but really nastily. All you see is like faces. You don't see what's actually going on with the physical torture. And that's done really well and done honestly. As I said, this was the last movie of Stanley Baker's career, and he had a long career of doing some really interesting character roles. He worked with Joseph Losey, among other things. He was in Zulu. He was in a whole bunch of different films. And I always liked Stanley Baker as an actor. And I don't think this is a particularly bad way to end your career. It's a gritty, tough, honest spy movie with a great ensemble cast. Stanley Baker carries the lead incredibly well in this one. Now, this version of Innocent Bystanders is from Olive Films, which is no longer extant, unfortunately. But if you look around and find a copy of this, you're going to have a good time with it. It really does do some really nice stuff with the spy genre that wasn't being done when you had goofy people like Roger Moore playing James Bond. It's a more grounded, more intelligent, and incredibly more entertaining spy movie than a lot of the shit that was coming around in 1972 when this one was made. I saw this in the cinemas and I liked it, and I read the books afterwards. Still got some of them. You should check this one out if you possibly can. Good spy movies like this deserve our respect. And in the 1970s, there were a lot of bad ones. Enjoying and respecting the good ones is a good thing. So that's what I got for you this time around. 2 different action films from more or less the same era within 4 years of each other, where one of them just doesn't know what the hell it's doing and the other one does know and does it really well, and started with the right background, which is a writer who knew his stuff and who adapted his own novel for the movie, which I think is always a good idea because the writer then knows the plot skeleton outwards. And I love this movie more than I love many, many other spy movies of the era. I also like that art, even though it's not in the tone of the movie at all. I do like that production art there for the advertising. It just works for me. And having Donald Pleasence's face there as a dark and malevolent force is the right tone for the film. So yeah, that's what I've got for you. I've got these 2. See if you can find them. See if you like them. If you like action films of the 60s and 70s, you're going to at least give them a go. And I think you'll have an entertaining time. And I'll bet 35 cents you like this one less than you like this one. So thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. You can also donate to the channel through YouTube, becoming a YouTube member, or by becoming a patron at patreon.com/TerryTalksMovies. There's advantages to doing any of those 3 things because we've got a giveaway coming up. I've just talked to Umbrella Entertainment and they've given me a 4K box set to give away around the end of the month. That's only going to be available to people who donate to the channel, are channel members, or are patrons on Patreon. And it's worthwhile. You're going to like it. And I will announce in my next video what that is. So until all of that exciting stuff happens, watch some good movies, watch some not so good movies, and I'll catch you next time.